50 Apache warriors surrounded Jedediah Kane's ranch at dawn, their war paint gleaming in the morning light, and every single one of them wanted the girl he'd hidden in his barn. 3 hours earlier, Jedediah had been checking his cattle near the Washita River when he heard gunshots. He urged his horse toward the sound, knowing he should ride the opposite direction. What he found there would change everything, setting him on a collision course with a past he couldn't outrun and a future he never imagined. If you believe one act of kindness can change the world, stay for this story. What Jedediah Kane found changed everything. A young Apache girl lay bleeding behind a fallen cottonwood, an army bullet lodged deep in her shoulder. Her buckskin dress was soaked crimson, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. She couldn't be more than 16, with fierce dark eyes that showed no fear, only a burning defiance. Jedediah's hand instinctively moved to his rifle. 3 years ago, Apache raiders had burned his neighbor's farm and killed Abigail, his wife of 12 years. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to ride away, to let nature take its course. The Indian Territory would be safer with one less Apache. But those eyes, they reminded him of Abigail's, not in appearance, but in their stubborn refusal to surrender, even in the face of death. The girl tried to crawl away when she saw him, leaving a trail of blood on the dry earth. She spoke rapid Apache words he didn't understand, but her meaning was clear: stay back. Jedediah dismounted slowly, his hands visible, his movements calm and non-threatening. The girl's breathing was getting weaker. Without medical attention, she'd be dead within the hour. He thought about Abigail, about the promise he'd made at her grave to never let hatred consume what was left of his soul. It was a promise he had struggled to keep, a constant battle against the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. He looked at the girl, so young, so fierce, and saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own loss, his own pain. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his grief, he scooped her into his arms. She fought weakly at first, a small, desperate struggle, then went limp from blood loss. Her weight was nothing. She was severely malnourished, probably fleeing with her band for weeks. The ride back to his ranch, the Lone Oak Ranch, felt eternal. Every shadow could hide a war party. Every bird call might signal pursuit. But Jedediah pressed on, the girl's labored breathing the only sound between them. At his cabin, he carried her not into the house, but to the barn, and laid her on a bed of fresh, clean hay. The bullet needed to come out immediately, and the barn, with its open space and better light, was the only place for such a grim task. As he heated his knife in the fire, preparing for the crude surgery that would either save her life or end her suffering, the girl's eyes opened. She stared at him with a mixture of confusion and a deep, primal terror. Why was this white man helping her? What did he want in return? Jedediah began working on the wound, and the girl bit down on a leather strap to muffle her screams. For 20 agonizing minutes that stretched into an eternity, he dug out bullet fragments while she bled and trembled, her small body convulsing with a pain he could only imagine. Finally, the bleeding stopped. The girl passed out from pain and exhaustion, her face pale as death. That's when Jedediah heard them. The war drums in the distance, a low, ominous heartbeat growing closer with each beat, a sound that every settler in the territory had learned to fear. This is a story of a man caught between his past and his conscience. If you're drawn to complex characters, hit that like button. The drums stopped at sunrise, and that's when Jedediah knew they'd found his ranch. He peered through the barn slats and counted them. 50 mounted warriors, painted for war, surrounding his property in a perfect, silent circle. Their leader sat tall on a painted stallion, an older man with gray streaks in his braided hair and scars across his chest that spoke of countless battles. The girl stirred behind him, a low moan escaping her lips, her body burning with fever. She whispered something in Apache, her voice barely audible. Jedediah didn't need a translation. She was calling for her father. The war chief raised his hand, and the circle of warriors tightened, a noose of silent menace. Jedediah could see the fury in their eyes, the way their horses stamped and snorted, eager for violence. These weren't raiders looking for cattle or supplies. These were grieving warriors who'd tracked their missing daughter through 20 miles of dangerous territory. Jedediah checked his weapons: 1 rifle, 2 pistols, maybe 30 rounds total. Against 50 experienced fighters, he might last 5 minutes, if he was lucky. But running wasn't an option anymore. The girl, whose name he now knew was Nita, couldn't be moved. And even if she could, they'd never outrun war horses across the open prairie. His act of mercy had become a death trap. The chief called out in broken English, his voice carrying across the morning air like thunder. "White man, you have what belongs to us." Jedediah Kane's mouth went dry. How could he explain this? That he'd saved their daughter's life, that he'd risked everything to help her. In their eyes, he was just another settler who'd taken something precious from them. He thought about responding, trying to negotiate, but what could he say? That he'd found her bleeding and brought her home? They'd see it as kidnapping. That he'd operated on her wound? They'd call it torture. The girl, Nita, tried to sit up, wincing from the pain. She looked at Jedediah with a new, terrible understanding. He hadn't saved her. He'd made himself a target. Now, both of them would die because of his misguided compassion. "Nita!" the chief shouted, and the girl's eyes filled with tears. She tried to call back, but her voice was too weak to carry, a fragile whisper against the vast, hostile silence. Jedediah made a decision then, a choice that went against every instinct for survival, a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days, however few they might be. He stepped out of the barn with his hands raised, leaving his weapons behind, a solitary, unarmed figure in a sea of painted warriors. 50 arrows tracked his movement. 50 fingers tightened on bowstrings. "She's alive," he called out, his voice a clear, steady beacon in the tense air. "Your daughter is alive. But she's hurt bad." The chief's expression didn't change. If anything, the rage in his eyes intensified. A white man claiming to help his daughter was worse than a white man who'd harmed her. At least enemies were honest about their intentions. "You lie." The chief spat, his voice thick with a contempt that was centuries old. "Show her to us." That's when Jedediah realized his terrible, fatal mistake. If he brought Nita out, they'd see the crude surgery, the blood-stained bandages, the way she could barely stand. To them, it would look like torture, not treatment. Her weakened state would be proof of his brutality, not his mercy. But if he refused to show her, they'd storm the barn anyway, and the violence would be uncontrollable, swift, and absolute. Behind him, Nita was struggling to her feet, a fierce, desperate determination overriding her pain. She had something to prove to her father, something to say that might save both their lives. The question was, would she defend the man who'd saved her, or would she condemn him to save herself? As she stumbled from the barn, clutching her bandaged shoulder, a fragile figure against the backdrop of the rising sun, she spoke 3 words in her native tongue that made her father's war paint seem to drain of color. "He saved me." The chief's stallion reared as if struck, his own shock mirrored in his mount's panicked movement. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind through the prairie grass and the creak of leather as 50 warriors shifted in their saddles, their mission of vengeance suddenly, inexplicably, thrown into doubt. A story of a single choice that can change everything. If you believe in the power of words, subscribe to Mr. Storytelling. But Jedediah could see it wasn't over. The chief's rival, a younger, ambitious warrior named Taza, whose belt was adorned with the fresh scalps of his enemies, was whispering urgently in his leader's ear. His gestures toward Jedediah were clear, his meaning unmistakable. This is still a trick, still a trap. Nita took 3 shaky steps toward her father and collapsed, her small body giving out. The fever was consuming her, and the effort of standing had drained what little strength she'd recovered. Jedediah instinctively moved to help her, a pure, unthinking reaction, but 20 arrows swung toward his chest, their sharpened points glinting in the morning light. "Don't," the chief, Akule, warned in English, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Don't touch her again." 2 Apache women dismounted and rushed to Nita's side. They examined her bandages, felt her burning forehead, and spoke in rapid, concerned tones. Jedediah watched their faces change as they realized the quality of the medical work, the clean, if crude, stitching, the proper wound care, the undeniable fact that she was alive at all. The older woman looked up at the chief and nodded once. The girl had been treated well, but Taza wasn't satisfied. He rode closer to Jedediah, his horse's hooves stopping just inches from the rancher's boots. Up close, Jedediah could see this warrior was maybe 25, with angry scars across his face and a hatred burning in his eyes like a prairie fire. "She is the chief's daughter," Taza said in broken English. "You take her, you die? All white men die." Jedediah realized then that this wasn't about Nita anymore. This young warrior wanted war, wanted revenge for something that had happened long before today. The girl's rescue had simply given him the excuse he'd been looking for. Chief Apache was studying Jedediah Kane with eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier violence, eyes that could read a man's soul in the flicker of his gaze. "Why?" he asked simply, the one-word question carrying the weight of 100 others. Why help an enemy? It was the question Jedediah had been asking himself since he'd first seen Nita bleeding behind that cottonwood. The question that had warred with the memory of his murdered wife, Abigail. Why risk everything for a people who had taken so much from him? Why throw away his life for a stranger? Because she was dying. Jedediah said finally, the truth of it stark and simple. And I couldn't watch someone die when I could prevent it. The chief's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in his hard eyes. Something in Jedediah's words, in their raw, unadorned honesty, had reached him. A father recognizing another man's humanity, perhaps. But Taza spat in the dirt and raised his rifle, his face a mask of contempt. "Lies. White man lies," he shouted. "He keeps her for a slave, for..." The ugly accusation hung in the air like poison, and Jedediah saw the doubt creeping back into the chief's eyes, saw the other warriors' faces hardening again. That's when Nita spoke again, her voice weak but carrying across the silent ranch with a surprising strength. Whatever she said made Taza's face go white with a rage that was mingled with a new, sharp fear. And then she said something else, a torrent of words that made her father, the great chief Akole, reach for the tomahawk at his belt, his own face a storm of disbelief and a terrible, dawning fury. In that moment, the truth exploded across the ranch like lightning, and Jedediah understood. Nita had told her father that Taza, his trusted rival, was the one who had led her into the army ambush in the first place. The chief's tomahawk wasn't meant for Jedediah. It was for the traitor who'd gotten his daughter shot. The young warrior had been feeding information to the cavalry at a place like Fort Sill, trading Apache lives for army gold, and Nita had witnessed his betrayal. "You speak lies, girl," Taza shouted, but his voice cracked with a panic that betrayed his guilt. "The fever makes you crazy." But it was too late. 3 other warriors, loyal to their chief, were already moving to surround him. Whatever Nita had said was specific enough, detailed enough, that her father believed every word. The chief's face had transformed from simple anger to a cold, deadly rage that made the morning air feel like the heart of winter. But Taza wasn't finished. Desperate men make desperate choices, and he would rather die fighting than face Apache justice for treason. In a single, fluid motion, his rifle swung toward Nita, his intent clear, to silence the only witness to his betrayal. A story of betrayal and honor on the frontier. If you're captivated by the unfolding drama, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Jedediah moved without thinking. 3 years of grief and guilt, of a promise made to a dying wife to not let hatred consume him, exploded into a single, decisive action. He launched himself at Taza, tackling the warrior from his horse. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the dust and prairie grass, a tangle of limbs and a desperate, brutal struggle for control of the weapon. The ranch erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted contradictory orders, some wanting to shoot Jedediah for attacking one of their own, others wanting to help him stop the man who had betrayed them all. Jedediah felt Taza's knife slice across his ribs, a hot, searing pain, but adrenaline numbed it, washed it away in a tide of pure, righteous fury. This was the fight he'd been preparing for since Abigail's death. Not against innocent people caught in the crossfire of a brutal war, but against the kind of cold, calculated evil that destroyed everything good in the world. They rolled again, and Taza ended up on top, his blade pressing toward Jedediah's throat. The young warrior's face was twisted with a rage born of desperation. "You should have minded your own business, white man," he snarled. Jedediah bucked upward, throwing Taza off balance just enough. His hand found a rock the size of his fist. One sharp, brutal swing connected with the traitor's temple, and the knife clattered away across the dirt. Taza lay still, breathing, but unconscious, a trickle of blood from his head wound soaking into the earth that had seen too much violence already. Silence settled over the Lone Oak Ranch like a heavy blanket. 50 warriors stared at the white man who had just risked his life to protect their chief's daughter from one of their own. Chief Akule dismounted slowly and walked to where Jedediah Kane knelt, breathing hard from the fight, his side a canvas of spreading crimson. For a long, silent moment, they looked at each other, two men who'd lost too much, seen too much, but still recognized honor when they saw it. "You fight to protect my daughter," the chief said, the words a simple statement of a profound truth. "I'd do it again," Jedediah replied, the words surprising him with their certainty. The chief nodded once, then spoke rapidly in his native tongue to his warriors. Half of them dismounted, their movements swift and purposeful. The other half began preparing to leave, but not in the way Jedediah had expected. Nita was being helped onto one of the horses despite her protests, her face a mask of confusion and a dawning, terrible sadness. She looked back at Jedediah, her eyes pleading, but her father's command was absolute. The chief wasn't done with his surprises. He pulled something from his belt and held it out to Jedediah. It was a medicine bag, intricately decorated with beadwork that must have taken months, even years, to complete, a sacred object of immense cultural value. "My daughter says you lost your wife, Abigail, to our people," the chief said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "This cannot bring her back, but it can protect you from dying before your time comes naturally." Jedediah stared at the offering, understanding the immense weight of what was being given. This wasn't just a gift. It was an adoption into protection, a sacred promise that this band, at least, would never raid his land again. It was the highest honor an outsider could receive, a sign of a bond forged in blood and betrayal. But as he reached for the medicine bag, a new sound cut through the tense quiet, gunshots erupting from the ridge overlooking his ranch. 20 cavalry soldiers from a place like Fort Sill appeared on the ridge, their rifles aimed not at him, but at the Apache warriors below. Their commander, a young, ambitious officer named Major Thorne, was shouting orders to fire at will. The trap had been perfectly planned, perfectly sprung. Someone had told the army about the Apache war party surrounding Jedediah's ranch, and now 50 warriors were caught in the open, with nowhere to run. Taza's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had realized. "Take cover," Jedediah shouted, his voice a raw command. But the Apache were already moving with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime of warfare. Within seconds, they transformed from a ceremonial gathering into a fighting force, using horses and the sparse buildings of the Lone Oak Ranch as shields against the rifle fire raining down from above. Chief Akule grabbed Nita and pulled her behind Jedediah's water trough just as bullets splintered the wood inches from her head. She was too weak to fight, too fevered to run, and now she was trapped in the middle of a massacre that was, in a twisted way, all because of her. Jedediah realized with a sick clarity that this was exactly what Taza had planned. Get caught helping a Comanche girl, draw the war party to his ranch, then signal the cavalry for a surprise attack. Taza would be hailed as a hero for leading the army to a decisive victory. But Taza hadn't counted on being exposed. Now he was unconscious in the dirt while his carefully orchestrated betrayal played out around him. A warrior cried out as a bullet found his shoulder. Another's horse screamed and collapsed. The cavalry had the high ground and superior firepower, but the Apache had something more valuable, nothing left to lose. "Kane," Major Thorne's voice carried over the gunfire. "Step away from the hostiles. We're here to rescue you." Jedediah looked at the warriors around him, men who'd been ready to kill him an hour ago, but were now fighting to protect his property from destruction. Akule caught his eye and nodded toward the house. "Go," the chief said simply. "This is not your war." But Jedediah was already moving toward his cabin, not to surrender, but to retrieve his rifle and ammunition. The army thought they were rescuing him. They were about to learn that some rescues weren't wanted. He burst through his front door and grabbed his Winchester, along with every box of cartridges he owned. Through his window, he could see the Apache taking defensive positions around his barn and outbuildings, turning his ranch into a fortress. When Jedediah emerged with his rifle, several warriors stared in disbelief. The chief's eyes widened as he understood what the white man intended to do. "You choose to fight with us?" the chief asked, his voice a mixture of awe and incredulity. "I choose to fight for what's right," Jedediah replied, taking aim at the ridge. "If you were Jedediah, what would you do? Join the army that's supposed to be on your side, or defend the people who came to kill you but showed you honor? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose because what Jedediah decided next would determine whether anyone survived the next 10 minutes. Jedediah Kane's first shot dropped the cavalry sergeant leading the charge, and suddenly, 20 soldiers were firing at the man they'd come to rescue. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him as bullets shattered his cabin windows and splintered his porch railings. By choosing to stand with the Apache, he'd made himself a target of his own people, a traitor in the eyes of the army. But watching Chief Akule fight to protect his daughter, Nita, with the same desperate ferocity he'd once felt trying to save his wife, Abigail, Jedediah knew he'd made the right choice. There were lines a man had to draw, and he had drawn his in the bloody soil of his own ranch. The Apache were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with the deadly precision of men who'd been warriors since childhood. They used every piece of cover, the barn, the water trough, the very bodies of their fallen horses, making every shot count and turning Jedediah's ranch into a killing field for anyone foolish enough to charge across the open ground. Major Thorne, a young officer with more ambition than experience, kept ordering frontal assaults that cost him men without gaining an inch of ground. After the third failed charge, his remaining soldiers were getting reluctant to follow orders that seemed designed only to get them killed. The battle was turning into a bloody stalemate, a war of attrition that no one could win. Meanwhile, Taza, the traitor, was waking up, his head wound bleeding but his treachery still intact. He crawled toward a fallen soldier's rifle, his eyes fixed on the water trough where Nita lay hidden. He intended to shoot her, to silence the only witness, while everyone was distracted by the larger battle. Jedediah saw the movement and swung his rifle around, but he was too far away, his angle blocked by a panicked horse. Taza's weapon was already rising, its dark muzzle pointing directly at the chief's daughter. That's when one of the Apache warriors, a young man who had been Taza's closest friend, made a choice that shocked everyone. Instead of shooting at the cavalry, he put an arrow through Taza's chest, permanently ending the traitor's war. The chief looked at the warrior who'd killed his own band member and nodded grimly. Justice, brutal and swift, had been served in the middle of chaos. The battle was turning. The cavalry had lost 7 men, the Apache, 2, and their ammunition was running low. But the Apache were almost out of arrows, and several warriors were wounded badly enough that they could barely hold their weapons. Jedediah was down to his last box of cartridges when he heard something that changed everything. More horses, approaching from the east. At first, he thought it was cavalry reinforcements from a place like Fort Sill, which would mean certain death for everyone defending the Lone Oak Ranch. But these weren't soldiers. They were ranchers from the surrounding territory, men from the Washita River Valley, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire. Men who knew Jedediah Kane as an honest, quiet neighbor, a man who'd helped them through hard winters and shared water during droughts. Major Thorne tried to wave them off, shouting that he was conducting a military operation against hostile Indians. But the ranchers had eyes. They could see Jedediah fighting alongside the Apache. They could see the girl, Nita, who was clearly wounded and being protected rather than held captive. This is the moment a community has to choose sides. What do you think will happen? Hit that subscribe button to find out. Silas Croft, who owned the spread 5 miles south, a man whose own life Jedediah had once saved during a cattle stampede, rode up to the cavalry commander with his own rifle ready. "What in hell are you doing, soldier boy?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That's Jedediah Kane down there, and he's no Indian fighter unless someone gives him cause to be." The commander's authority was crumbling. His men were demoralized. His mission was exposed as something darker than a rescue. And now he had armed civilians questioning his orders. But wounded men with nothing to lose make dangerous enemies. The commander's hand moved to his sidearm, and Jedediah realized the officer was prepared to shoot his way out of this situation rather than face a court-martial for attacking innocent ranchers. The chief saw it, too, and their eyes met across the battlefield as they both understood what was about to happen. Major Thorne drew his pistol on Silas Croft, but the chief's tomahawk, thrown with a speed and accuracy born of a lifetime of warfare, found his skull before the shot could fire. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, threw down their weapons when faced with 20 angry ranchers who'd known Jedediah Kane for years. These weren't career soldiers. They were farm boys and drifters who'd joined the army for steady pay, not to massacre civilians on a Texas ranch. Silas Croft dismounted and walked over to where Jedediah Kane knelt beside the water trough, checking on Nita's condition. The girl's fever had broken during the fighting, her eyes clearer now, though she was still weak from her original wound. "Jedediah," Silas said quietly, his voice rough with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You want to tell me what this is all about?" So Jedediah told the story, from finding Nita wounded by the Washita River, to treating her injuries, to the arrival of the war party, Taza's betrayal, and the Army's unprovoked attack on what should have been a peaceful resolution. The other ranchers listened in silence, their faces grim, a dawning understanding gradually replacing their initial confusion. They had come expecting to find their neighbor under siege by savages. They had found him in the middle of a complex web of honor, betrayal, and a corrupt military operation. The chief, Akule, approached slowly, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder. He looked at the dead cavalry commander, then at the soldiers sitting in the dirt with their hands raised, then at the ranchers who'd intervened to stop a massacre. "This white man," the chief said, pointing at Jedediah, "has more honor than soldiers who wear blue coats." Silas Croft nodded. "Jedediah's always been decent folk. If he says the girl needed help, then she needed help." But the situation was far from resolved. 23 soldiers were dead or wounded. A cavalry commander was dead on Jedediah's property, and an Apache war party was standing in the middle of white ranchers' territory. This was the kind of incident that started wars between entire peoples, a spark that could set the whole of the Indian territory ablaze. The chief seemed to understand this, too. He spoke rapidly to his warriors, who began preparing to leave despite their own wounded. Better to retreat now than wait for more soldiers to arrive seeking vengeance for their fallen commander. "Wait," Jedediah said, his voice a low command. He looked at Nita, who was strong enough now to sit up on her own, but was in no condition for a hard ride. "She's not ready to travel. The wound could reopen." The chief's jaw tightened. Every minute they stayed on this land increased the danger, but his daughter's life was worth more than any tactical advantage. "We take that risk," he decided. But Nita had something to say about her own fate. She struggled to her feet, leaning on the water trough for support, and spoke in her native tongue, her voice carrying the clear, undeniable authority of a chief's daughter. Despite her youth, whatever she said made her father's eyes widen with a surprise that was quickly followed by a deep, grudging respect. She was refusing to leave. She was claiming sanctuary at Jedediah's ranch under Apache law, placing herself under his protection until she was fully healed. The chief looked at Jedediah with an expression that mixed respect with a deep, profound concern. "She chooses to trust you with her life," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If anything happens to her." He didn't need to finish the threat. But he also handed Jedediah the medicine bag he'd offered earlier, this time not as a gift, but as a binding contract, sealing a bond that would change both their lives forever. That's when they heard it. The sound of more cavalry, approaching from 3 different directions, a massive force moving with a speed that spoke of a larger, more organized response. The approaching cavalry, however, turned out to be Colonel Vance from a place like Fort Sill, a senior officer riding with 2 companies and a white flag. He'd come to negotiate, not to fight. Vance was old Army, a man who'd seen enough frontier violence to know the difference between justice and massacre. When he surveyed the scene at Jedediah's ranch, the dead soldiers, the Apache warriors, and the ranchers standing together, he understood immediately that something had gone very wrong. Major Thorne was ordered to investigate reports of a kidnapping, Vance said carefully, his eyes taking in every detail. Not to engage in open warfare. Silas Croft spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Your boy Thorne was fixin' to shoot me for asking questions, Colonel. If that chief hadn't put a tomahawk in his skull, we'd be burying white folks, too." The colonel's experienced eyes took in the scene. Nita's medical bandages, the quality of treatment she'd received, the way the Apache warriors were protecting rather than threatening her. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a rescue that had turned into a political nightmare. But Vance had survived 30 years of frontier politics by finding solutions that satisfied everyone's honor without starting wars. He looked at the chief, then at Jedediah, then at the medicine bag hanging from the rancher's belt. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding," he said diplomatically. "The army received information that a white settler was holding a Comanche girl against her will. Clearly, that information was incorrect." The chief nodded slowly. "This white man saved my daughter's life. We came to honor this act, not to make war." "And yet, 23 soldiers are dead," Vance observed. "Because they attacked while we spoke of peace," the chief replied. "Your commander fired first. This is a story where honor is more powerful than any law. If you believe in that, subscribe to Mr. Storytelling." Colonel Vance could see the political calculation in Chief Akule's words. Both sides needed a way to end this without losing face or starting a broader conflict. The truth of what happened at the Lone Oak Ranch was messy, a tangled web of betrayal, honor, and misplaced aggression. But the solution could be simple. "I propose this," Vance said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "The Army officially records that Major Thorne exceeded his authority and attacked peaceful negotiations. The Apache returned to their territory with our apologies for the misunderstanding. Mr. Kane continues his life as a respected member of this community. It was a face-saving lie that everyone could live with. The dead soldiers would be honored as victims of their commander's poor judgment rather than heroes of a righteous cause, a quiet acknowledgement of the Army's tragic mistake." But the matter of Nita remained. She still refused to leave until her wound was fully healed. For 2 weeks, she stayed at Jedediah Kane's ranch, now under the protection of both Apache law and an official Army guarantee. During that time, something unexpected happened. The silence that had defined their first few days together was replaced by a quiet, steady conversation. She began teaching him her language, the soft, melodic sounds a stark contrast to the harshness of the land around them. He, in turn, taught her to read English from an old, worn Bible he kept by his bed, the only book he owned. They shared stories about their peoples, their losses, their hopes for a future where understanding might replace violence. They discovered in each other a shared history of grief and a common desire for a world that was better than the one they had known. The bond forged in the crucible of battle was now tempered by a deep and growing affection. When she finally left, riding strong and healthy back to her father's band, both of them had been irrevocably changed. Jedediah was no longer just a reclusive rancher haunted by the memory of his murdered wife, Abigail. He was a man who had found a new purpose, a bridge between two worlds. The chief kept his word about the protection. For the rest of his life, no Apache ever raided Jedediah Kane's land. More importantly, when other settlers in the Indian Territory faced raids or conflicts, they often came to Jedediah as a mediator, the one white man who had earned the Apache chief's respect, a man who spoke their language and understood their ways. His ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, became a neutral ground where Apache and white settlers could meet safely to trade, to talk, and sometimes to find solutions to conflicts that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. His act of saving one life had, in the end, saved countless others. Nita grew up to become a wise and powerful leader, a peace negotiator between her people and the encroaching settlements. She used the reading skills Jedediah had taught her to understand the treaties and legal documents that previous generations of her people had signed without comprehension, ensuring that her tribe would not be cheated or deceived again. She never married, but her legacy was in the peace she helped to forge, a peace built on the foundation of a single, compassionate act. And Jedediah, he never remarried either, but he was never truly alone. His ranch was a place of constant comings and goings, a hub of a new kind of community. The medicine bag the chief had given him still hung from his belt when he died peacefully 30 years later, surrounded by neighbors, both white and Apache, who mourned the passing of a man who had proven that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one, and that the truest measure of a man's life is not in what he takes from the world, but in what he gives back. His story became a quiet legend in the Washita River Valley, a testament to the fact that even in the most divided of lands, a single act of courage can plant the seeds of a lasting peace. This story reminds us that the greatest legacies are often built not of stone, but of kindness. If it resonated with you, please comment 9 and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of hope. For more tales of the American West, be sure to subscribe to Mr. Storytelling.